Robert's the executive chairman of Global Canada. He's had a career in the public, private, and not-for-profit sectors as the president, deputy minister of the Canadian International Development Agency, president and COO of Bombardier, the international group of Bombardier, rather. Started his career at McKinsey and is now the executive chairman of the Global Canada Initiative and professor of practice in the Institute for the Study of International Development at McGill University. I first met Robert about almost 10 years ago now, when Robert started, when I joined an organization that I'd been wanting to join for a number of years, called the Banff Forum. And maybe we'll get a bit, maybe we'll hear a bit of the story of the Banff Forum along the way here. We're going to talk mostly about the COVID Strategic Choices group that Robert helped convene. I didn't even mention his role in the World Economic Forum. One of the great things about learning from Robert as a prospective or emerging or active change maker is that with Robert, you get a sense of the work still to be done. And Robert is very hungry to continue change-making work in whatever field he's in by doing one of the things that he does best: ask really good questions and put the right people together to answer those questions. I don't know if you see it that way, but that's one of the things I see that you do. And so thanks so much, Robert, for joining us today.
It's a great pleasure. Thanks very much for the opportunity.
So maybe let's just talk. We've shared the report with the students. Can you talk to us about the genesis of the Strategic Choices group and the kinds of conversations, the kinds of ideas that you have in relation to what you're seeing governments in power doing, and what prompted you to start this group?
Yeah, well, it actually came out of the work we're doing with Global Canada in terms of looking at what's going on in the world and the difference Canada could be making internationally. Obviously, COVID is such a global challenge. This fall, when our second wave was starting here, we looked at what are international examples of democracies that had succeeded. And we produced a report that basically came out in the fall saying there are a number, what we call the Tanzanite jurisdictions, Taiwan's, Australia's, and New Zealand's, but also Atlantic and Northern Canada, that had actually succeeded with a zero or near zero COVID strategy. And when we analyzed the situation of Canada, our view was, with water on three sides, with only one border, it was possible for us to actually move to a near zero approach. And that if we'd done that in the summer, it would have been a better situation in the fall. So we basically said, we think it's possible. We don't know, we think it's feasible. We don't know if it's preferable compared to where we are with other options. So we suggested that people should look at this. And so we waited a number of weeks, a number of months, and nobody had actually then looked at it in more detail. So then we moved from the initial diagnostic to say, well, let's go to the next step. And so what we did is assembled about 15 or 20 extraordinary people, epidemiologists, public health professionals, economists, and people in the private sector, people with public sector experience, to basically look at, given where we were in the late fall and coming up to Christmas, what actually was the preferable strategy for Canada. And so we analyzed the mitigation approach that people have been using right now, just trying to manage COVID. We looked at the Melbourne model of trying to just crush COVID. And we looked at something in between, which we call the Canadian Shield, was a sort of a 4 to 6 week lockdown, followed by a continual reduction going forward post-lockdown to try to get us to near zero COVID by the spring or early summer, which we call the Canadian Shield as the best way to protect people from COVID and from the consequences of COVID. But then what was important is we used epidemiologists to really model what would that really look like. And we used economists at Queen's University with Limestone Analytics to actually model, well, was it actually a preferable economic solution? Because in some cases you may have trade-offs between health or social and economic outcomes. And our conclusion was the Canadian Shield and the Melbourne model were both much better in terms of health outcomes, in terms of lives saved, compared to what we were doing of just trying to manage wave after wave. It also turned out that the Canadian Shield model was much better economically as well, that this trade-off between health and economics was actually a false trade-off. And that we've seen with Atlantic Canada superior performance to the rest of Canada, the fact that Australia, Taiwan, and New Zealand all did better than Western Europe or North America last year, but also in this model, we actually found that it was a robust strategy. It just wasn't the one that was being done. And so what we did with the Canadian Shield is laid that out. And actually, in a sense, the lockdown post-Christmas reflects very much what we were recommending. And I believe we helped inform some of the decisions by some of the provinces in doing that. And that led us to, in the last few weeks, say, okay, that's fine. If this was a variant-free situation, we would be fine. But now we have to deal with variants. So the next stage of what we've done with the Canadian Shield group and the COVID Strategic Choices group is to look at how you would handle the variants. And in that, we went from the high strategy to very focused operational implementation. And I can talk about that if you wish later on. But basically, that was the idea of the Canadian Shield, was to take a concept or a set of analysis we had looked at and to then see whether we could translate it into actionable strategy recommendations for governments.
Yeah. So what's one of the interesting things about your work and its relationship to what was happening was that you had a model. You had, you put out a question into the world around
Right.
Where was it working?
Exactly.
And then you determined the shared characteristics of those individual places that were doing doing that approach. How does that? You've been a very senior authority in governments.
Yeah.
How would having a model like that compare to what was happening in Canadian governments, not just federally but provincially? Did they have competing models? Was their competing model one of, as you said, managing it, or was it not having a model and just doing tactics?
Well, we had the advantage of being away from the daily battle, from being in the fog of COVID war. So we could step back and be strategic. I would say in the fall, people were being very tactical, very reactive, especially as they had a model that had laid out that summer that said, hey, we've basically got COVID down to a reasonable level. We'll manage it. We can sort of just adjust a little bit and we'll get through this at a low level. Hard to think about that now. But basically what was happening is their mental model of how this would work, which experts had laid out, was falling apart. And yet they didn't know what the alternative was, and they didn't have the chance to step back and actually look at this systematically, which is what we were able to do. We were able to lay out the questions, and then we were able to lay out these objective analysis, which many governments already deeply invested in a wrong strategy were not able to do.
What was interesting about the models that you and the individual situations that you looked at that were successful is they were varied. They were highly varied. You had island countries.
Yeah.
You had or jurisdictions that were more diverse, and some that were less diverse, either ethnically or economically. So it seemed like there were lots of different. It seemed like the model you put forward was one that could be adopted by a number of different jurisdictions, because places that were already different had, as it turned out, a shared approach. Did those jurisdictions, were they in communication with each other? Were they learning from each other, or did they come across their findings independently?
I think a bit of both. Certainly in Canada and in the Australian states, there was a lot of just simultaneous invention, where basically in Australia, they fell into a zero COVID approach because their idea was just to try to mitigate it, but they actually did so well that they said, hey, maybe we can go further. And then what was very important, this is where there was a learning from others, was a positive neighborhood effect. When they looked around, they saw New Zealand, right? Mm. And New Zealand had actually got to zero. And I think their view was, well, the Kiwis can do this, so can we. And so they actually looked to that as a challenge. And when we interviewed them, that was very much the case. That had an influence. For us, we had a negative neighborhood effect. We actually looked around and said, you know what, we're doing better than the Americans. And Europe's kind of doing our way. So let's be like the Europeans, and let's kind of just sort of have this mitigation approach. And I think there was a little bit of Eurocentrism in this, in the sense that, you know, why is it we spent so much time looking at Sweden, whose approach has turned out consistently to be really bad on this, you know, extraordinary people, but just a really bad approach. Mm-hmm. And yet we spent so little time looking at South Korea, Taiwan, New Zealand and Australia, you know, places in the Asia Pacific. It was somehow like, no, that's not relevant. But if the Europeans are doing it, it's relevant for us. So I think it was that combination.
That's a really helpful. I want to do a bit of I want to go out a bit and then come back, because I think this is consistent with one of the themes you've struck a lot in your career, that Canadians need to do a better job of looking outside in the right way.
Yeah.
So it sounds like and I want to get back to the Maritimes in a second, because that's a neighbor that's, as a New Brunswicker who is upset that I can't see my mother, but very pleased that she will soon be getting the vaccine and lives in a community that has no COVID. Um, some of us are living this both ways. So I want to come back to the Maritimes in a second, the Atlantic provinces in a second. But do you think one of the things we'll take away from this, or do you hope one of the learnings that we take away from COVID-19 and this pandemic is that global mindedness, just there's yet another reason to be more globally conscious? And what actions can we take as a country to start living that dream?
I think we need to be much more globally minded. I think we need to be much more humble in terms of what elements of our models need significant improvement, our social models, our political models. And I think we need to be much more open to learning from every part of the world and every part of society. Two things that struck me very much this. One is, I've always said complacency kills, but complacency really kills. Mm-hmm. We can no longer afford to be complacent. And it's been the challenge of our society for some time, right? So in terms of how we look at ourselves and what injustices still remain internally, but also in terms of what we do externally, I think this stepping up and no longer being so complacent is key. I think the other element is for us to have honest conversations about so many issues that we talked about in development. The social determinants of health, the issues of privilege, issues of entitlement. Conversations that have been at a certain level in our society turned out to be front and center when you look at the realities of COVID. So I think it's a huge wake-up call. And if we seize that, it could be a very constructive wake-up call. But certainly, we do need to change how we're looking at the world and our willingness to learn from the world.
And what explains our failure to look at what was happening within Canada? We had an ongoing maritime success story. I remember watching the CTV, if not the decision makers, then the typical person on the street who was following the news in a casual way had an awareness that the Maritimes were succeeding. On the one hand, there was actually a lawsuit filed by the CCLA, Canadian Civil Liberties Association, with whom Leadership Lab is allied on a number of issues, but maybe not on this one, saying that we should that one of the restrictions was unconstitutional. But what explains that failure to see what was happening in our own backyard that was plainly apparent to anyone who was even paying a modicum of attention?
It's a great question. I don't know the answer. I've asked people in New Brunswick and Nova Scotia that, and also in Yukon, because three groups did very well in the first wave, right? The Atlantic provinces, the Northern Territories, and their leadership there, and then Indigenous communities in BC and across the country actually took this much more seriously because of their own probably lived experience with infectious diseases, whether it's smallpox before or TB now. But for whatever reason, they had actually done a better job. Mm-hmm. But I was actually surprised at how much better a job they had done, because it actually wasn't talked about that much. And I think again, in Montreal or Toronto or Ottawa, we may have a tendency to look to the major centers rather than to the so-called periphery on these things. It may also be that those communities themselves were not blowing their horn. I mean, it was interesting when I was asking people in Atlantic Canada, like, why aren't you saying more about this, particularly as it's in your vested interest that the rest of Canada step up? But their view was, well, we're just trying to do it, we're just trying to get through. And they weren't actually willing to feeling the need to step up and amplify this in a way that I actually think would have been useful.
I want to understand a bit about the process of change making as exhibited through this project.
Yeah.
You assembled the group, you put the first piece of work out. It was not received in the way that you had hoped, the crisis was getting worse, then you assembled the group, you put out a paper, and things got rolling. So I have a few questions. One is, how do you pick up the phone and call over to Australia and New Zealand? Maybe there's some things in your background. How do you get this? How do you collect information like this? How do you get on the phone with Australia and New Zealand? And then how do you put together a group like this?
So, I mean, how do you do it? You actually just pick up the phone and do it. So, I mean, most of the people I interacted with internationally and domestically in this, I'd never met before, right? So Steve Drucker, who's a key Australian health economist who also played a key role actually in Alberta and has written on both Australian and Canadian health. I simply approached him through Twitter and then emailed him and actually interviewed him. And that was just the way to do it. And what's been great about COVID is because it's all of us trying to fight a same common challenge, a same common threat, there's been a level of goodwill or bienveillance, which has been really heartening. And so people were just eager to try to help. So that was the first thing, just not be shy to do it. The second was, we really tried to work hard on the diagnostic, like what was the situation as we saw it? What was objectively working or not working in other places, and to provide a certain intellectual rigor, like not coming at it from a point of view of we want to prove X or Y, it's we want to understand X and Y. And then the third thing that was very important was when we looked at bringing together the group to try to actually crack the code on this, was to be very interdisciplinary, to sort of say who are excellent people across these different fields. And what we were able to really contribute in this was two things. One is, at a time when people are getting very much into tactical issues, should you shut Toronto down for a week or not? You know, should you be opening these schools or not? Should you be dealing with aerosol issues in the schools, which were all important. But the broader issue of, was the overall strategy working or failing? We were trying to do it at the strategic level. And the second thing we tried to bring to this was, we tried to be very fact-based and constructive. I think all of us have been incredibly frustrated at one point or another with any number of our leaders. But what we tried not to do was to sort of add to the pile on.
Right.
What we tried to do is to provide facts and arguments and constructive suggestions to help people find a sort of a path out of the corner they had painted themselves in.
So you, using that approach, you brought together a great group of diverse perspectives and disciplines, and you assembled the advice. Just talk to us, and you don't tell us anything we shouldn't know. But how do you get it? How do you get attention for that? Work?
Let me give you an example, a very concrete one on the issue of variants and the need to close our borders, because it was, basically it was clear in January that that there was a real danger we were going to get overrun by what was happening with the variants, like in the UK and Ireland. And so what we did there was we first of all tried to really do the diagnostic of just, why should decision makers care about this through the analysis. The second thing we tried to provide is what concretely could they do? So in a sense, the sort of 3-pager we developed was you can literally take this as a policy action brief, and you can take these and you can implement these specific items bit by bit. And we'd actually reviewed them not only for operational doability, but we also reviewed them with human rights and charter lawyers to make sure they actually met charter constraints on Section 6 in terms of freedom of travel and other elements. So they were operational. And then we actually engaged in doing polling to ensure that, in fact, there was a broad support for the specific measures. And then we went beyond our group and put it out and invited experts in the field to sign up. So we had over 100 different experts. So what we were able to do is basically do 3 things that every decision maker, needs to wrestle with, which is, why should I care? What can I do? Will there be support for me to do this? Right. And we were able to basically provide, people who were wrestling with so many different things with the answers to those 3 fundamental questions. Right. And that's what made it, I think, extremely useful.
Yeah, we've shared that with the students in the Making the Future class. And a note here, What you're describing, incidentally, is the field of politics without being a politician.
Yeah.
About putting together the information and working with leadership to say, will there be public support? And potentially some of the things that, one of the interesting things I think about what you've put out there is sometimes there's not sometimes leaders don't have an accurate assessment of their own self-interest or an accurate diagnosis of not only the policy diagnosis, but sometimes they might not have an accurate diagnosis of the public opinion situation. So perhaps there might be more readiness than they think for some of the measures that you put forward.
There often is. And I think one of the things that's important is, in some ways, the bigger the issue, the more ambiguous the issue, the less good, clear advice leaders often have. So on everyday tactical things or technical things, there can be tons of studies done. But on things like this, which no elected leader in Canada had ever experienced before, there wasn't actually necessarily a playbook that they could refer to, or a lot of people who necessarily had the experience they could count on. And so in those cases, being able to provide, well thought through, well synthesized perspectives is extremely helpful.
Yeah. And again, just a key insight here, the structuring of how to think about the problem with the associated information can be so potent, and you're able to distill it. We have some questions from the students from Slido that I just want to pull on a few of these. One is a question, do you have a plan to, or is there a way to tie these recommendations or through these recommendations to get people in marginalized communities, people who might not have elite access to the website, might not be reading the news, is there a way to let them know about this advice?
Well, one of the things we've been doing is actually experimenting with trying to reach out to people into those different communities to actually not just, ensure they have access to what we're recommending, but also to make sure that their voices are heard in our decision making and in our recommendations. And so, a lot of the different communities that a lot of essential workers come from, where there have been levels of COVID that are multiples of other more privileged communities, and where there's been incredible creativity in terms of figuring out ways of communicating to the community, protecting the community, supporting the community. How do we make sure that those views and recommendations are included in some of the work we're doing right now? For example, in the lead up to this variance report we're going to be doing, is something we're trying to do. And the way we've tried to do that is to reach out to the people who know the people who are engaging with that community, rather than me, myself, trying to do that, because I actually don't have the network or the credibility for that conversation. So that's the way we've tried to do it.
That's a key insight. Thank you. And that's one of the things, incidentally, we try to do through the first policy response project is to get connect the policymakers to the front lines, and we have some success on that with some of our projects. Question from Tahira: what advice would you give to better manage a pandemic if we were to experience one in the future?
I guess maybe three. One is follow the science up front. I mean, this was an incredibly predictable and predicted event. And there are going to be, so we know there's going to be different sort of drug-resistant microbes that are going to be becoming hugely problematic in the next 5 or 10 years. So why don't we actually start investing in dealing with them now? So this idea of doing it up front, like in many cases, you want to deal with issues before they become crises and then metastasize into catastrophes, right? And it's getting them before they get off the runway, which is really important. And so that would be the first thing. Like the first way to deal with a pandemic is to make sure it doesn't become a pandemic. The second then is to make sure you're really listening to the right people. And one of the best groups I've found in this has been people who've actually had experience in developing countries, particularly in Africa, and also dealing with Ebola and other outbreaks. They had much better instincts than many of the people who had done a lot of their work, including infectious diseases here in Canada. And then I guess the third is to be really open to learning real time from everybody, right? I mean, if we had basically just applied what South Korea had been doing or Taiwan had been doing right from the first day, like we could say, we'll figure it out, we'll test it, but we'll actually just, they're using masks, we'll use masks. They're quarantine people who come in, so we'll quarantine people who come in. They had just gone through so much learning themselves on this before. And so this idea of quick learning from others would be the three elements of it.
Thank you. That's very helpful. And it's interesting. We on some economic policy ideas, we did do quick learning from others. You'll recall the income supports that were devised in the spring were initially quite inadequate, and then people were rightfully pointing out that again, most of the European countries had set different levels of income support, and the federal government quickly came in with some more enhanced supports. Although on the wage subsidy, which was turned out to be a less effective program than anticipated. It's a very important point. Thank you for making it around the learnings from the Ebola crisis. And again, I suspect I won't ask you this. I won't ask you to answer this question, but I suspect there was not a lot of outbound communication from Canada, North America, Europe into Africa, or with African health experts on the experience, on their Ebola experience. So that's also a very helpful observation. Now it's funny because some things are being learned and some things still haven't been learned. And so the one thing I would observe that has still not been sufficiently learned is the importance of regular testing. And we continue now, almost a year into the pandemic, to not have adequate testing infrastructure, or it hasn't been deployed well enough so that we don't have regular testing for as many people who need it. Can you speak to, did you look at testing much and rapid testing as part of
Yes, and in fact, it's going to be one of the things that we're coming out with on the variants is the issue of pushing more on testing and pushing more on communication and engaging more with people again on this. I mean, even everything from, using 3-layer masks and double masking and other elements. How do people know about these things, right? And I think there's two observations I would make. We tend to fetishize technology, like it's the vaccine that's going to do this, right? Or it's going to be, or institutions are going to solve this. As compared to focusing on community and individual action. Mm-hmm. And what's been really interesting is how many of these successful jurisdictions are based on community engagement, including the community engagement in Atlantic Canada, Northern Canada, Indigenous communities compared to other parts of Canada. And to the idea of kind of individual empowerment and role, and really making sure that people are doing all that they should be doing individually, as opposed to relying on the technology. Mm-hmm. And I mean, I guess we'll see in a sense, the strongest example of this is the United States, where there is a technology solution. I mean, they're going to be distributing 3 million vaccines a day within a few weeks. And so they'll have come up with a technology solution to this. But the death that has been created by the lack of coherent community engagement on this has been devastating. And I think it's also one of the challenges we have almost existentially as a society. Do societies in crises come together or come apart? And what can we do to ensure that we come together in crises?
That's a great observation. We're going to learn a bit more about this in this class in the coming weeks. Laura Griffin, who's from Newfoundland, Labrador, mentions the importance of a tight culture there. Can you diagnose can you just say more about what you mean by that sense of mutual commitment, that sense of community, and where that can trump a technical solution? Where does that come from?
I don't know. I would say generally Canada's community engagement has been relatively strong compared to the United States or even some Western European societies. I just think the places that got to the near zero did it even better than the rest of us. Mm-hmm. I mean, one of the things that's been surprising to me is just the amount of vitriol on every side that's been involved in this. I mean, when you said about something trumping something, I have got more Trump-like blowback on the engagement of this over the last couple of months that I've had in my entire career. And I think in the United States, that's been particularly problematic. Mm-hmm. But I think it's a symptom of a disease in the society during a time of crisis people still tear one another apart instead of really coming together on this. Now, in terms of how we deal with that, I don't know the answer. I expect many of the people in your class here would have better answers for this than I would.
And I wonder, in a sense, why we haven't done more of that with respect to some of the recurring outrages that we've experienced in this pandemic, especially in long-term care. But I don't want to spend too much time on that when we have a lot of other good questions from students. So let me just put a couple others to you. Is it realistic to have a Canadian Shield approach now that we've in Toronto, in the Greater Toronto area, we've had 2+ months of lockdown we're facing? Can people endure? Or is there going to be that willingness for the Canadian Shield approach?
Yeah, because the whole point of the Canadian Shield was actually not to have multi-month lockdowns. It was to actually have the 4 to 6 week lockdowns as we had in most other places, and then be able to move up. I mean, in Toronto, we've kind of had a zombie lockdown, not really alive, not really, like kind of a half lockdown. So in terms of what's actually necessary at this point, there probably does need to be continued constraint for the next 2 to 3 months. But we should be able to actually constrain COVID through more rapid testing, through more tracing and isolation and other support, through things like sick pay or COVID compliance pay, so that you can actually constrain the virus while actually liberating personal and economic activities step by step. But you need to get the sequence right on that. And you need to be able to really invest in this. And so the idea of really expanding rapid testings in every high school, really improving ventilation in every high school, like moving beyond ideological fights on this and just doing it, is the way for us to continue constraining the COVID while liberating people. And that's what we need to be doing. The other thing that's really important is we need to set a path towards victory. Because there's a danger that people are going to say, okay, now we've vaccinated the oldest people, we should just kind of let it rip, like a Burlington Declaration, redux. A better way would probably say, no, actually, now's the time to drive it down towards zero. So in places that don't have variants, let's keep driving it down 20% a week. So actually by July 1st, there's virtually no COVID in Manitoba or in Northern Ontario or other places without variants. And where there are variants, we should be able to get there by late July, so that every Canadian actually has a safe summer and then a COVID-free fall. I mean, the goal should absolutely be that by September 1st, there should be no community transmission of COVID anywhere in Canada, right?
You've said some really important things in that segment, and I just want to draw them out to show them back to people. So you made an observation about you made a couple of policy analyses there that are important. Constrain COVID, but liberate people, i.e. those policies are not necessarily in opposition.
Right.
If you decide what you want to liberate people towards. So in your analysis, if I'm hearing it correctly, you're liberating people towards schools ought to be the first to open and the last to close.
Yeah.
And that, I think I was hearing perhaps my bias showing here a bit, but that outdoor activity is maybe more to be encouraged than it's been to date.
Yeah.
You also said, you also laid out some conditions for victory. What I'm hearing right now from our leadership is the condition for the victory is the getting of the vaccine in as many arms as possible. And that's an attractive condition for victory, but it's also indeterminate.
And it's to do what? Is it to then be able to kind of have this thing circulate like some kind of mega flu, but with this idea that somehow it won't hurt or kill as many people? Or is it that we actually use the vaccination reduction in transmission to drive COVID out, as we drove out smallpox, or as we've driven out polio, or as we generally drive out measles out of our communities, so we actually live free of the fear of COVID? And we actually need to get to that point, because you won't hear politicians saying that right now, because in a sense they don't want to commit themselves to. But I think it's doable. It's the right thing to do, and people need to hear this. They need to hear what victory looks like and how and when we'll deliver it. And my view would be, we should have a near zero victory by July, and we should have a full COVID-free victory by September. and we should lay that out. And I think people would be prepared to take a lot of additional sacrifice if necessary, if they can see that that's a real achievable goal.
Safe summer, COVID-free fall, which again, that's a policy orientation, which is different than wait for the vaccine.
Yes.
And as you're saying, it also maybe creates more space to then have that next conversation, which isn't going to be easy, around what is. There have been a few questions from students around what else are we going to have to do, not only to fight the next pandemic, but what kind of longer term alterations does this mean to our social and economic framework? And you mentioned, so maybe I'll create some space for you to respond there.
Well, one element of that is we really have to start measuring race and other elements in Canada more honestly and completely. I mean, it was because I was very involved in a lot of the statistical stuff up front. And it was shocking how difficult it was to demonstrate how certain communities and other were really being disproportionately hit by this, because we didn't have the data on it, because StatsCan and other didn't actually do this. And I guess it was because we felt well, unlike the Americans, we don't, we're kind of post-collar. We don't need to talk about these issues. Well, that's just clearly not true in so many ways. And I think we need to be honest about that. So, and so this idea of diagnosing some of the learnings, in terms of some of the challenges we have in our society, and how we put in place some of the mechanisms to more systematically address this. I mean, that's not a new debate, but in a sense, COVID's made it all the more real. And putting in things like changing how Statistics Canada records data to include these things systematically seems like a minor thing, but it's actually pretty fundamental. Because if you change how things are measured, well, if you change how things are measured, you changed how they're managed.
StatsCan just put out this week a report on the Black experience of during the pandemic, which is one of the first reports I've seen by them about the Black community in Canada. So a really important take on that. There's a question from Alex Wu around in Canada, we don't have the strongest federal government. We have very strong provinces that are responsible for a lot of these, just in terms of jurisdictionally. The British North America Act, the Constitution Act, has us be very decentralized. Does that just mean that there's going to be an inability to have that collective response, even if it's differentiated by region or by province? Was that something that stopped us from having a collective response?
Yeah, so I think that's actually, so I think a federal system has turned out to actually be potentially a strength in this. In Australia, they ended up getting to COVID zero because of their federal system. The national, fairly right-wing liberal government there didn't want at all to push towards zero COVID. They just kind of wanted to let the economy open up as soon as they could. And it was actually the states that actually had discovered that you could get to COVID zero that actually then sort of collectively determined with the national government, we're going to set up a strategy of suppression with a goal of zero community transmission. But it was thanks to their federal system that they're actually able to do these pilots. And throughout our history, it's just like whether it's with Medicare or whatever, a lot of the best innovations have come out of the provincial level. So I actually think, and also in terms of why did Atlantic Canada demonstrate what could be done here, it was because actually there was a decentralized approach. I think what happened is the federal government, and I was a federal deputy minister. I think we have one of the best bureaucracies in the G7, but it actually didn't do very well on a number of things. The early warning system was disbanded. PHAC was not able to step up to this as strongly as it could have. We were very slow and ineffective on border issues for months and months and months and months and months. Like there was, and even the way in which it's been implemented this week in terms of some of the horrors around the hotel quarantine. I mean, there have been operational failures. And then the vaccine element, in terms of how it was done, I'm sure there was lots of well-meaning folks involved in that, but the fact is we're number 40 because we didn't actually negotiate as effectively as 39 other countries. And so I don't think any of that's because it's a decentralized system. I think it's because in those areas of federal responsibility, the government just did okay when it needed to do great. So I would say the solution is not to look at rebalancing federation. It's to really push for world-class excellence in everything each particular pillar of government does. So I don't think the federal government should spend a lot of time setting up national criteria for long-term care homes.
Right.
I think every citizen in every province should absolutely hold their provincial governments account to that. But if the federal government wanted to really set up a proper national pharmacare program, or really want to make sure that dealing with the next pandemic, we really have PHAC at world class, I think that would be really a good idea. Like in their areas of competence, really excel rather than telling the provinces in their area of competence what they should be doing.
It sounds like you're a dog with a bone and you're not going to let go of this work, which is, I know, side of the desk work. So talk to us about what you've learned through this. You've obviously learned a lot about pandemics and epidemiology through this project. What have you learned about how to influence power, how to make change?
Well, so what have I learned? I've learned there's amazing people here, which I guess, is no surprise, but there's so many extraordinary people of goodwill who've come together on this. And I think, and that's been very heartwarming. I think this has reiterated for me the importance of being able to provide objective strategic advice that's really based on clear articulation of the key issues of the questions, and then really objective, rigorous analysis to try to determine what the right answers to those questions are, with really an interdisciplinary or kind of multi-stakeholder or multi-sectoral perspective. I mean, those things have all been, and that's been, as you mentioned at the beginning, that's sort of how I've liked to do things through my career. So that's been a reaffirmation. I think what has been a shock to me is, as I mentioned earlier, the degrees to which issues like economic determinants of health, unconscious bias, privilege and entitlement have actually warped and undermined elements of our response to this in a way that I would not have believed was possible before experiencing it. And so, in Montreal, on our first wave here, the difference in infection rates between Westmount, where I live, and Montreal Nord, and the limited access that people in the first weeks in Montreal Nord had to testing, let alone support, was, for me, unimaginable. But it was actually reality. And so that's, sort of what I've learned. There's certain things that I've had reconfirmed in a positive way, but there's also certain things I've learned which have been less positive, but I think are perhaps even more important.
Thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure to have the experience of learning from you this last 45 minutes, Robert. On behalf of the Students in Making the Future First Policy Response and the Ryerson Leadership Lab, I want to thank you so much for joining us.
All the leaders and future leaders here, good luck with all that you'll be doing on this.
And we'll be continuing to follow the project and the next version of the variance advice. And thank you so much.